Okay, we are continuing ancient China. We're still on the oracle bones. So once again, bones of animals. We inscribe them, we write on them, throw them in the fire, they crack. We use the cracks to interpret and record. But why else are these important? Well, let's see. This is just a poem from the Zhou dynasty. So whatever. Okay, so these oracle bones tell us more than just, whatever fortune the people were having read. Some of these oracle bones are inscriptions from the name of an approximate date of the Xia dynasty and the Shang rulers. So this is one of the ways we know they are real. Some or other bones suggest that their purpose was to communicate with the gods and not just to tell a fortune. So once again, we're not even clear on what exactly they were for. Could easily have been both. You throw it in, communicate with the gods, and then you look at the cracks to try to determine the answer. So what's special about the Shangs besides, what you already know? They had limited contact with the rest of the world, though we have seen trade with Mesopotamia through a long journey. Once again, most of this started out as just the Indo-European people. However, it looks like that did change, where they ended up setting up some of their own routes. They were so isolated that they believed themselves to be the center of the world, however. They didn't realize that Mesopotamia at that point could compete with them. And they had an ethnocentric attitude, which means they considered themselves superior to all others, maybe why they weren't going out and seeing what else is out there. And they were accomplished bronze workers using horse-drawn chariots, developed the spoked wheel. Once again, Mesopotamians, Sumerians developed the wheel. It looks like they did develop the spoked wheel, taking the wheel from the Sumerians and expanding on it. And they became experts with the production of pottery and, more importantly, silk. This is going to give them an advantage in trade. And they devised a decimal system and a highly accurate calendar. So these guys were not purely ignorant. So once again, they're political and religious organizations. They are, they are ruled by a specific internal clans, each with its own king. This is more similar to the ancient Celtic system before they were united, usually against Rome. But they did have a specific internal kings or clans. Each clan did have its own leader, and thus kingship and kinship were linked. As the head of his biological clan in the geographical realm, the king one performed the rituals and sacrifices. Yeah, they're committing sacrifice. Waged war, controlled the irrigation and flood control system, although once again many of the areas didn't even have irrigation, but they did have a flood problem, and administered the government. And it is thought that they were descended from the god of the spirits. Notice the lower G. They do worship ancestors, so this is a little bit different. And once again, we're just looking at the Shang for being descended from the god of the spirits. And of course, that meant they had the divine right of kings, as usual. So had divine rights. You're going to see this again and again until the Age of Enlightenment, where that whole I'm king because God chose me, I'm chosen by the gods. That's why you have to do what I say. It took until the Enlightenment where people are like, wait a second, that doesn't sound right. So political and religious organizations of the Shang. Woo! Within the ruler directly controlled a growing network of towns. He ruled from his capital city and he designated the representatives to oversee regions, cities. Most of these representatives were blood relatives. We're not doing merit-based. This is, you put the blood relatives in. Yeah, that's a problem. Don't do that. And the relatives received titles to lands, shares in the harvest, and rights to build and control the regional capital cities. So you had a full ruling family that were living on the backs of the peasants. Not a good thing. And in exchange, they were represented and served the king and his interest in the province. Then again, the king's a family member. As long as he's in power, they're in power. Of course they're going to serve him. So their class organization under the Shang, obviously the ruling families at the top under the Shang dynasty. Inside the walled area lived the royal family. So they're also, of course, protected. And then the nobility and the retainers. After that, outside of the palace was a network of residential areas. We're still in a walled city. To the north were the dwelling and graves of the wealthy and powerful, marked by ritual bronze vessels and sacrificial victims. Human sacrifice. I believe I mentioned to somebody else, yeah, we'd get a little bit more into this. So the Shang dynasty did commit human sacrifice. Unfortunately, we don't know very much about that. To the south were the dwellings of the commoners and the burial places in trash pits. Yeah, the poor were buried about the same place they threw out their trash. And these occupations were inherited within specific family units, meaning you have a caste system. If your father's a farmer, you're going to grow up a farmer. If your father's the blacksmith, you're going to be the blacksmith. And many Zhou or lineage groups corresponded to occupational groups. Think of the Zhou more as, what's the word I'm looking for they had in the Middle Ages? Well, basically they're a lineage group. So all of your textile workers, they're cousins. All of your blacksmiths are cousins. All of your jewelry makers are distant cousins. And just to keep it in the family, guess who they're marrying? They're cousins. So there is a huge focus, however, on family, as the family is so important. Multiple generations of the same family lived in the same household, which was a patriarchal institution headed by the oldest male. So you have to put up with crazy old grandpa. Shang religion held that gods controlled all aspects of people's lives. So you're objecting to it. You don't want to be a blacksmith because maybe you don't do well with heat. Well, too bad. God sent you to a family of blacksmiths. You're going to be a blacksmith. Perhaps you didn't want to be a farmer. You want to be a clothing designer. Well, you were born to a farmer. Guess what? You're a farmer. And people believed they could call on the spirits of their dead ancestors to act as their advocates with the gods. This was called the veneration of the ancestors. Yes, Milan was originally of the Shang dynasty. But the worshipping of ancestors continued much further down, and this gave extended family even greater significance. So, think of doing family history today, but you believe you actually have to call on those ancestors to even communicate with God. Yeah, that means you're really paying attention to who you're related to or come from. And women in ancient China. I think Romans have it bad. So there was some evidence that women had power in the earliest of the Chinese dynasties. However, by the time of the Shang dynasty, all evidence points to China as a very patriarchal society, wherein women had fewer options than the men. It's this way with a lot of societies. China seems to be worse than others, where you can see evidence that they had plenty of freedom to begin with, and at some point their rights were taken away. They ended up in a very patriarchal system, and they find themselves stuck with few options. So let's get to Anyang, which is the last Shang capital. As I mentioned, they're going to get taken out by the Zhous. The Zhous will be taken out by the Qin dynasty. So the final, most important, most powerful capital of the Shang dynasty was Anyang. The capital was the center of a network of sites stretching about 200 miles. Though the area has been pillaged and farmed for years, there are some discoveries that include bronze treasures and royal graves. However, the Shang also produced bronze axes, knives, spears, and arrowheads, as well as utensils. So like the Cretes, they did have utensils, ritual vessels, and sculptures. The use of the horse-drawn chariots, which have been derived from the Indo-Europeans who migrated into China. So according to those who have been excavating Anyang, yes, it looks like they got the chariot definitely from Indo-Europe. Most likely, as I mentioned, the Mesopotamians did have chariots, as did the Egypts and the ancient Greeks. So it looks like one of them did come up with it, although I'm still betting more than one did at the same time. I think the light bulb, several people are working on it at once. So then the Zhou dynasty. The Shang dynasty fell to the Zhou dynasty at about 1122 BC, but did not completely disappear. It took a while to conquer it all. The Zhou survived for more than 600 years, making it one of the longest lasting of the Chinese dynasties. The Zhou dynasty, and you'll notice once again our nice map up through Beijing, the Yellow Sea, because Huanghe is such a great river. We are now also moving into the Yangtze River as well. There's the East Chinese Sea and the Pacific Ocean. So the Zhou dynasty lasts from 1122 to 256. They developed along the Wei River in northwest China. And one of the most important written sources for Zhou political thought is a book of documents which describes the Zhou conquest of the Shang. And the Zhou portrayed a corrupt Shang king who succumbed to wine, women, and greed. So, once again, they lost the mandate of heaven because you were a horrid king. So the ancestors told me, we have to come conquer you. Here is the story. I'm impressed if you couldn't understand it. I have no clue. So the mandate of heaven, which you've heard me say this several times, use this phrase. The mandate of heaven developed during the Zhou dynasty and dominated Chinese thought well into the 20th century. This is the same thing that the Qin are going to tell the Zhou when they take over. Oh, lost the mandate of heaven. It's based on 4 principles. The right to rule is granted by heaven. There is only one heaven. Therefore, there can only be one ruler. God's not going to change his mind. The right to rule is based on the virtue of the ruler, which serves as a check on the ruler's power. Meaning, if the ruler's evil, you've lost the mandate of heaven. They don't want you as king. You're not good enough. So they're going to send somebody else to take you out. And the right to rule is not limited to one dynasty, which justifies rebellion as long as the rebellion is successful. So if the present government succeeds and wins this the civil war, they had not lost the mandate of heaven, and this new dynasty had no right to come after them, and they were wrong. But if the rebels win, then, well, obviously the king had lost the mandate of heaven, and the rebels were just serving the will of the god. So Zhou's contributions to Chinese culture include a book of songs, which includes a collection of China's earliest poetry, which includes insights into family life and gender relations in early China. They were actually better under the Shang dynasty than the Zhou dynasty. These poems make it clear that men pursue women in courtship and not the other way around. Sorry, girls, you can't ask him out on the date. He has to pursue you. Psh. And other poems speak of a deep distrust of women in politics and argue that men alone should be in public sphere and that women belong at home. You see this in the difference between the original poem of Mulan and the Ballad of Mulan. In the Ballad of Mulan, she's executed at the end for impersonating a man. In the original poem, it took them years to figure out she was a man or a woman, and by then she was their great general. They had no reason to get rid of her. And it ends with them talking about a couple rabbits. And how when they're running together, you can't tell which is a man or a woman or male or female. And the idea is, of course, if you know a man and a woman are fighting together, running together, you can't tell the difference. They're warriors. Well, the Zhou wanted to change that. The Zhou transformed warfare as well. They developed the cavalry, in which soldiers fought with bows and horses on horseback. However, they were nothing compared to the Mongols. They introduced infantry troops of draft foot soldiers, so draft, you do see that in the cartoon of Mulan, where basically the emperor's going, we're calling up, the army. They didn't have a choice. That's a draft. They also expanded significantly, creating a larger state than had been ruled by the Shang. So they are the ones who started really growing China, and they created a decentralized administration that left much power in local hands, so governors, viziers, whatever you want to call them. But they ended, because, you know what, they went corrupt. They really did. They lost the mandate of heaven. So the Zhou's bureaucratic government remained popular in China for thousands of years. And the last years of the Zhou dynasty are known as a period, though, of warring states. And the Zhou were attacked by nomadic people from the West. As often happens, somebody else is going to come in. And remember, by then, the Zhou are using still bronze weapons. Well, the Hittites have come around several hundred years before. They're like 600 BC. And now we're in the 200s BC. They kind of missed that little memo from the Hittites of, hey, we've got a better way to make weapons. Then guess what happened? The nomads are trading with the people in the West. They come from the West. They've got better weapons. And once again, what happens when one side's got much better weapons than the other side? I don't care how powerful you are. You're going bye-bye unless you can find that little tiny hole in the Death Star. You're going bye-bye. So have fun. The next set of notes will be the Qin and Han dynasties.